We're excited now to be joined by Lord Christopher Monckton himself, very much on the cutting edge of fighting against the climate regime changers who want to take over our world, curb civilization, and really put us in our place. We're not going to let that happen, of course. Thank you for joining us, Lord Monckton.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and let's hope that we can, between us, convince the powers that be that backing the climate scare has been a failure, and they must get off it and think of something else to frighten us with.
Well, it was only a few years ago Al Gore and company were telling us the debate was over, this climate change, really new way of thinking was just inevitable and we should all submit. But they've had a number of setbacks at the past few meetings. They've really had their agenda stalled. But at the same time, we have the revival of Agenda 21 this year, Rio Plus 20 conference, 20 years after the first time the United Nations held a summit on how to bring about sustainable development. Let's get into that and how it ties into the larger climate change issues.
What has happened is they've lost the argument with the public on the climate. In fact, they've lost the scientific argument as well as the economic argument. And because they've lost it, they know they've got to find something else to justify the continued existence of the UN. See, the UN has become a very expensive body. It's a lot of money the nations pay towards it. It's increasingly wanting to have governing power. It's wanting to undermine the very concept of a sovereign, independent nation, because they want to have, effectively, global government. Now, they know if one talks of world government, this is something that will be very unpopular. So instead of calling it world government, they call it global governance. This is the new phrase for it, which somehow sounds nice and respectable and not too dangerous. But of course, what they're really after is total control. And the idea of the Rio Plus 20 conference is to suggest that the nations of the West have been raping the planet with their insatiable demands for natural resources, land to build houses and roads and airports on, and that now humans must be reduced, according to one of the more extremist papers put forward for this conference, by 5 billion of our present, I think it's 6 billion of our present 7 billion must be done away with, and we're down to be having not more than 1 billion humans on the planet. Really extreme stuff on the fringes of this. Now, the draft document, the draft conclusions of the conferences, it's already been decided roughly what the conclusions are going to be. I've seen that document, and compared with some of the more extreme climate documents I've seen from these conferences, it's pretty milk and water so far, which means that the real draft hasn't, in fact, yet been made available. But what I think they're going to try to do is to follow a route which the EU knows well, where you have annual incremental conferences, as they've done with the climate, with agreements at the end of each conference, because the negotiators don't want to go home and say we haven't even signed an agreement. And each of these agreements gradually takes on the force of what your constitution called customary international law. And once that happens, even if they aren't signed into law by your Senate as a treaty, which has to vote for treaties by a 2/3 majority, they can still become the law of the land if the Supreme Court, which is very much that way inclined at the moment, were to say that they were. And that's how they're going to circumvent the constitutional requirement that a treaty has to be ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. And they're going to do roughly what was done to us as we lost our powers in Britain to the EU, with these endless succession of treaties, each of which doesn't seem to change things all that much compared with the previous treaties. At least that's the official storyline. And yet at the end of the process, you suddenly find you've lost your nation, you've lost your democracy, you've lost your parliament. We still have one, we still have elections, but they mean nothing. 5/6 of our laws being made by someone else. And the UN has seen this and has very jealously thought to itself, well, if the EU can do it on a regional scale, why don't we try the same approach on a global scale? So they invited the EU to send advisors to the Cancun conference, for instance, on the climate 2 years ago, to advise them on how to start building up these incremental annual treaties or agreements that have the effect of treaties even though the Senate doesn't ratify them, until you get to the point where the UN is suddenly wound up with all the power, and all the media will say, well, of course, it was inevitable from the start. They're going to try to play the same game, but an interesting development has now arisen. The EU, which had previously regarded itself as almost a sovereign nation, and that's the way it's been trying to go, taking away sovereign power from the individual member states and putting them all into the EU. It has suddenly realized that if the UN takes global domination, then the EU will be subservient to it. And they've suddenly realized they don't like that. So there's a wonderful irony. They've been taking all this power from the member states of the EU, including Britain. Now, they don't want that power taken from them and given to the UN. They've suddenly woken up to the fact that the advice they've been giving the UN on how to do this is going to lead to their own subjugation to the UN. And the EU bureaucrats really don't like this. And they have now said, really, I think for this reason, though they'll never admit it is for this reason, they're not even going to send an EU delegation to the UN Climate Conference, the UN Sustainable Development Conference in Rio. But I will be there because it's very necessary that the superficially admirable goal of sustainable development should be one which is implemented sensibly and not by unelected international authorities such as the UN. This brings me really on to another problem which is beginning to emerge when you look at things like the Rio +20 conference. What is happening is that increasingly these international bodies are saying, give us the power, give us the wealth, give us the decision-making and legislative power so that we make the laws for the whole world. But not one of these international bodies is elected by anyone. The EU isn't. The UN isn't. The Law of the Sea Conference, very topical at the moment because there's another treaty which people are trying to push the US into. They are not elected. And it's really a simple enough point. Every time you transfer power from elected hands here to an international or supranational or regional or global body, you are transferring power from elected hands here to unelected hands somewhere else. And the rule that I would want to put in really as an amendment to your constitution, because the founding fathers didn't foresee this one, would be to say that no legislative power shall be handed over by the Congress of the United States to any supranational or global entity unless that supranational or global entity is one whose governing cabinet or council has been elected by universal suffrage among all the peoples of the states parties to the convention that established that particular bureaucracy. So, no more power to any international organization unless that organization is elected by the states parties to the treaty setting it up.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And of course, they're going after not only national sovereignty and regional sovereignty, but individual sovereignty. I mean, that's really what sustainable development's all about.
The people know best what is best for the people. The governing class knows best what's best for the governing class. The governing class wants to use the environment as an excuse for accreting more power to itself, centralizing that power in regional and increasingly now in global institutions. Where does this leave the individual? You are now told, or we certainly are in Europe, what kind of light bulbs you can and can't use. Now, what business is that of a supranational or global government, or even a national one for that matter? And there's a very useful Catholic principle here. The Catholic philosophy of government is quite well developed in the documents of various councils and popes going back 2,000 years. And there's a principle which is now known as subsidiarity, by which this principle simply asserts that the decisions of government should be taken at the most local level that it is possible for that decision to be taken. So, for instance, really nobody except the family itself needs to decide what kind of light bulbs its children will read by. That is not the business even of the local authorities, let alone national, supranational or global ones. So if we are to make sure that the individual continues to be the basic building block of society, and the family then is the next building block up, and the state only comes in after that, then we must not allow these international groupings, such as the UN at the Sustainable Development Conference, to take away from the individual the powers and the rights of decision which properly belong to him and his family. And this is a very important philosophical point, which I think is often lost when one is looking at the political side of all this. And one of the things that the governing class, as the French call it, the classe politique, worldwide, is now guilty of is a desire to micromanage. This, of course, at one level, all government is instinctually totalitarian. And by totalitarian, I mean desiring to interfere in every little detail of our lives, light bulbs and all. They're control freaks. It goes with being in government. You want to exercise control. That's what government is. It is control. So to some extent, all in government are control freaks. And the totalitarians are the ones who are the most open about it. And they say, we want to govern because we think we know best. But you see, your government exists under a constitution that your founding fathers saw was going to be necessary precisely to protect you from the overambition of the governing elite. And your constitution makes it very plain that there shall be a proper separation of powers, a very traditional document in many ways, this constitution. There should be a legislature, that's where this constitution starts, all legislative power in the hands of the Congress that you elect. Nobody else has any unless the people you elect are given it. Then they describe the executive, that's the office of the president and his cabinet, and then the judiciary, and the separate powers of each, and the ways that they interact. All of these are carefully thought about, and if you read, say, the Federalist Papers or the Madison Diaries, where all of these things are mused upon and considered by some of the great men, the greatest men of their age, in that long, hot summer in Philadelphia, they had a vision which I wish we still had in Britain and Europe, that the people know best what's best for the people, that the people should rule via the ballot box at regular intervals. I would like to carry that still further. I would like to have the right of initiative referendum built into constitutions like this, so that you don't even allow the Congress exclusively to decide what bills shall be debated. You, the people, should have that power too. But when it comes then to these international conferences, like this UN conference, everything in this constitution is alien to the people who are behind this sustainable development agenda.
Yeah, and they have a pattern of usurpation. And some of the top globalists talked about probably 50 years ago how they're trying to do an end run around sovereignty, particularly with reference to the U.S. Now, when it comes to Agenda 21, we've seen this kind of development where they're installing components. Obama set up something called the Rule Council that has everybody from Homeland Security to Department of Defense to EPA on it. Yeah. And they said, well, we want to crack down on farms because of the environment, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to have the EPA regulating dust. We're going to have the Transportation Department regulating who's allowed to ride on a tractor or run a vehicle, and slap on all these other types of licensing components to try to do an end run around individual farming and the ability to run your own communities.
And one thing you should always watch out for in all this is, why are they going after the farmers? Why did they previously go after the fossil fuel companies? Because these are the big supporters of, and donors to, the Republican opponents of the Democrat Party. And the Democrats, like socialists everywhere, have learnt that if you really want to rule, then what you do is you go after all the big donors to your opponents, and you do it in several different ways. First of all, you do it by regulation, regulating farming so that it becomes less profitable, shutting down the fossil fuel industries as best you can. There's now 150-odd coal-fired plants on hold that should be being built now to keep these lights on, not being built because the Democrats are determined to shut down the big fossil fuel donors to the Republican Party. So there's very much a selfishness in this, and you see it again in the UN's Agenda 21 proposals. These are not well-intentioned proposals for the genuine environmental stewardship of the planet, because frankly, governments like yours and a nation as experienced as yours are perfectly capable of regulating your own environment without having some UN bureaucracy to tell you what to do.
We'll definitely give it a try first anyway.
Well, that would be, I think, the way forward. And so you always have to watch out for the Democrats trying to do down the big funders of the Republican Party and Republican leaders. That's what they're after. It's after this total domination, and you see it over and over again. They're always at it. They're always encroaching in various ways. It's become a very expensive body. It's a lot of money the nations pay towards it. It's increasingly wanting to have governing power. It's wanting to undermine the very concept of a sovereign, independent nation, because they want to have effectively global government. Now, they know if one talks of world government, this is something.
Thank you for joining us, Lord Monckton.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and let's hope that we can, between us, convince the powers that be that backing the climate scare has been a failure, and they must get off it and think of something else to frighten us with.
Well, it was only a few years ago Al Gore and company were telling us the debate was over, this climate change. We're excited now to be joined by Lord Christopher Monckton himself, very much on the cutting edge of fighting against the climate regime changers who want to take over our world, curb civilization, and really put us in our place. We're not going to let that happen, of course. Let's get into that and how it ties into the larger climate change issues.
What has happened is they've lost the argument with the public on the climate. In fact, they've lost the scientific argument as well as the economic argument. And because they've lost it, they know they've got to find something else to justify the continued existence of the UN. See, the UN...
Really new way of thinking was just inevitable, and we should all submit. But they've had a number of setbacks at the past few meetings. They've really had their agenda stalled. But at the same time, we have the revival of Agenda 21 this year, Rio Plus 20 conference, 20 years after the first time the United Nations held a summit on how to bring about sustainable development.